In the bustling heart of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, a scene was unfolding that would soon capture the attention of millions across the nation. It was a warm summer morning in July 2023, and the air was thick with the usual cacophony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried conversations. Amidst this chaos, a tall, distinguished-looking African-American man in his mid-30s stood patiently at the check-in counter for a first-class flight to Washington, D.C. This man was Staff Sergeant Cadell Thompson, a decorated soldier returning from his third tour in Afghanistan. Cadell, with his close-cropped hair and ramrod-straight posture, cut an impressive figure even in civilian clothes. His deep brown eyes, which had seen the horrors of war, now looked forward to a few days of rest before reporting back to duty. As he waited, Cadell couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had worked hard for this first-class ticket, saving up his combat pay for months to treat himself to a comfortable journey home. Behind Cadell in the queue stood a middle-aged white woman named Karen Whitfield. Karen, with her designer handbag and meticulously styled blonde hair, exuded an air of entitlement. She tapped her foot impatiently, checking her watch every few seconds, as if time itself should bend to her will. Karen was a successful real estate agent from the affluent Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, used to getting her way in most situations. As Cadell approached the counter, the airline representative, a young woman named Oriana Johnson, greeted him with a warm smile. Oriana, with her kind eyes and gentle demeanor, had always taken pride in treating every passenger with respect and dignity. She began the check-in process, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she entered Cadell's information. It was at this moment that Karen's impatience got the better of her. She stepped forward, clearing her throat loudly to get Oriana's attention. Oriana, ever the professional, politely asked Karen to wait her turn. But Karen was not one to be dismissed so easily. She began to voice her complaints, loudly enough for those nearby to hear, about the ridiculously slow service and how she was going to miss her very important meeting if things didn't speed up. Cadell, feeling uncomfortable with the situation, offered to let Karen go ahead of him. It was a gesture of kindness, born from years of putting others before himself. However, Karen's reaction was far from grateful. She looked Cadell up and down, her eyes narrowing as she took in his casual attire and carry-on bag. In a voice dripping with condescension, she questioned how someone like him could afford a first-class ticket. The air in the terminal seemed to freeze. Other passengers waiting in line exchanged uncomfortable glances, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval at Karen's blatant display of prejudice. Oriana, the airline representative, felt her cheeks flush with anger, but she maintained her professional composure. Cadell, for his part, stood tall and dignified in the face of Karen's insult. Years of military discipline had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but even he couldn't completely hide the flash of hurt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice rang out from behind them. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to General Michael Hawkins, a highly decorated military officer who had been standing just a few people behind in the queue. General Hawkins, a tall, imposing figure with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, had witnessed the entire exchange. His presence commanded immediate attention, and the surrounding area fell into a hushed silence. Karen, not realizing who had spoken, turned with an exasperated sigh. "Yes, there is a problem. This gentleman," she said, gesturing dismissively at Cadell, "is holding up the line, and I have a very important meeting to get to." General Hawkins stepped forward, his eyes flickering between Karen and Cadell. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but controlled, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Are you suggesting that this man doesn't belong in first class?" Karen, still oblivious to the general's identity, lifted her chin defiantly. "Well, it's just that first class is usually reserved for, a certain type of person." The general's eyes hardened. "And what type of person would that be, ma'am?" As Karen stammered, trying to find a way to express her prejudice without sounding overtly racist, General Hawkins turned to Cadell. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," he said, recognizing the soldier immediately. "It's good to see you, son. I trust your flight from Kabul was uneventful?" Cadell snapped to attention, offering a crisp salute. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Karen's face paled as the realization of her mistake began to dawn on her. The general continued, his voice carrying easily to the now silent onlookers. For those who may not be aware, Staff Sergeant Thompson here is one of our nation's finest. He's just returning from his third tour in Afghanistan, where he led a team that successfully neutralized a major threat to our troops and Afghan civilians alike. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted palpably. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation was now transforming into a moment of recognition and respect. Other passengers, many of whom had been silently watching the scene unfold, began to murmur words of thanks and appreciation to Cadell. Karen, her face now a mixture of embarrassment and shame, tried to backpedal. I had no idea. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. But General Hawkins wasn't finished. Ma'am, in the United States military, we judge people by their character and their actions, not by the color of their skin or the clothes they wear. Staff Sergeant Thompson has earned his place in first class 1,000 times over, not just with his money, but with his blood, sweat, and sacrifice for this country. The general's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Oriana, the airline representative, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of anxiety and admiration, stepped in. Staff Sergeant Thompson, General Hawkins, please allow me to complete your check-in. It would be our airline's honor to upgrade you both to our premium first-class seats. As Oriana processed their tickets, a spontaneous round of applause broke out in the terminal. Passengers who had witnessed the entire exchange were moved by the general's words and Cadell's quiet dignity in the face of prejudice. Some were wiping away tears, while others were nodding in agreement with the general's statement. Karen, thoroughly chastened, slunk away from the counter, her earlier bravado completely deflated. As she retreated, several passengers shot her disapproving looks, while others shook their heads in disappointment. Cadell, still somewhat overwhelmed by the turn of events, accepted his new ticket with gratitude. As he and General Hawkins moved away from the counter, several people approached them, offering handshakes and words of thanks for their service. One elderly gentleman, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, stopped Cadell. "Son," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I served in Vietnam. What you just experienced, it's not right. But the way you handled it, with such grace and dignity, you make me proud to be an American." As Cadell and General Hawkins made their way to the first-class lounge, the incident at the check-in counter had already begun to spread through the airport. Passengers were recounting the story to others, many expressing their shock at Karen's behavior and their admiration for Cadell's composure. In the quiet of the lounge, General Hawkins turned to Cadell. "You handled that situation admirably, Staff Sergeant. It's not easy to maintain your composure in the face of such blatant prejudice." Cadell nodded, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Thank you, sir. It's not the first time I've encountered something like this, but it never gets easier." The general's expression softened. "No, I imagine it doesn't, but know this, Thompson. Your actions today, your dignity in the face of ignorance, that's what changes minds. It's slow, it's painful, but it's necessary." As they settled into their seats, Cadell couldn't help but reflect on the incident. He thought about his parents, who had always taught him to hold his head high no matter what. He thought about his fellow soldiers, men and women of all races and backgrounds, who had fought and bled beside him. And he thought about the long road ahead, not just for himself, but for the country he had sworn to protect. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Karen Whitfield sat alone, her earlier arrogance replaced by a deep sense of shame. She watched as other passengers boarded the plane, many of them still discussing the incident they had witnessed. For the first time in her life, Karen began to truly examine her own prejudices and the harm they could cause. As the flight to Washington, D.C. took off, carrying Cadell, General Hawkins, and yes, even Karen, the story of what had transpired at Atlanta's airport was already spreading. In the age of social media, it didn't take long for someone who had witnessed the event to post about it online. Within hours, the post had gone viral, shared thousands of times across various platforms. The story resonated with people across the country. Many saw in Cadell's experience a reflection of their own struggles with prejudice and discrimination. Others were moved by the general's powerful words about judging people by their character rather than their appearance. And still others found hope in the way the other passengers had rallied around Cadell, showing that for every act of prejudice, there were many more people willing to stand up for what was right. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Cadell dozed fitfully, his mind replaying the events of the morning. In his dreams, he saw flashes of his time in Afghanistan, the camaraderie with his fellow soldiers, the fear during firefights, the joy of helping Afghan children. But he also saw faces from his past, teachers who had doubted him, strangers who had crossed the street to avoid him, employers who had passed him over despite his qualifications. The incident at the airport had brought all these memories flooding back. General Hawkins, sitting across the aisle, watched the young soldier with a mixture of pride and concern. He had seen too many good men and women struggle with the weight of both their military service and the prejudice they faced at home. He made a mental note to speak with Cadell once they landed, to ensure he had the support he needed. Back in Atlanta, the story continued to unfold. Local news stations had picked up on the viral social media posts and were now running the story on their evening broadcasts. Reporters descended on the airport, interviewing witnesses and trying to piece together exactly what had happened. Oriana Johnson, the airline representative who had handled the situation with such professionalism, found herself suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Journalists were eager to hear her account of the events, and her responses were measured and thoughtful. "What I witnessed today was a reminder that we still have work to do as a society," she told one reporter. But it was also a beautiful example of how people can come together to stand up against injustice. As the story gained traction, it sparked a national conversation about racial prejudice, military service, and the nature of respect. Talk show hosts debated the incident, social commentators wrote opinion pieces, and military officials released statements condemning discrimination against service members. In Washington, D.C., as the plane began its descent, Cadell stirred from his uneasy sleep. He checked his phone and was stunned to see the flood of notifications, messages from friends and family who had heard about the incident, news alerts mentioning his name, and an overwhelming outpouring of support from strangers across the country. As they taxied to the gate, General Hawkins leaned across the aisle. "Thompson," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what happened today, it's not going to be swept under the rug. We're going to use this as a teaching moment, not just for the military, but for the whole country." Cadell nodded, feeling a mix of emotions: gratitude for the general's support, pride in how he had handled the situation, but also a deep wariness at the thought of becoming the center of a national discussion on race. As they disembarked, Cadell and the general were met by a small contingent of military officials who'd been hastily assembled once news of the incident broke. Among them was Colonel Jessica Ramirez, a high-ranking officer in the Army's Equal Opportunity Office. Colonel Ramirez approached Cadell, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," she said, shaking his hand firmly, "I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. We've already begun an investigation into the incident, and we'll be using it to strengthen our diversity and inclusion training programs." Cadell, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention, simply nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that." As they made their way through the airport, Cadell couldn't help but notice the looks he was getting from other travelers. Some offered smiles and nods of respect, while others seemed to be trying to place where they had seen him before. It was an uncomfortable reminder that his private experience had become a public spectacle. Meanwhile, Karen Whitfield exited the plane last, her head down and her designer bag clutched tightly to her chest. As she walked through the terminal, she could feel the weight of disapproving stares from those who had recognized her from the viral stories. The shame and regret she felt were palpable, and for the first time in her life, Karen began to truly understand the impact of her prejudiced attitudes. As she reached the baggage claim area, Karen was approached by a young African-American woman who had been on the same flight. The woman, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness, spoke softly but firmly. "I hope you understand now," she said, that your words and actions have consequences, that they hurt real people with real lives and real feelings. Karen, her voice choked with emotion, could only nod. I'm so sorry, she managed to say. I know it doesn't change what I did, but I'm truly, deeply sorry. The young woman held Karen's gaze for a long moment before nodding once and walking away. It was a small interaction, but for Karen, it was the beginning of a long and difficult journey of self-reflection and change. Back in the VIP section of the airport, Cadell was being briefed on what to expect in the coming days. Military public affairs officers explained that there would likely be media requests for interviews, that his story would be used in military training materials, and that he might be called upon to speak at various events about his experience. Cadell listened to all of this with a growing sense of unease. He was a soldier, trained to face enemy fire and navigate complex war zones. But this, being thrust into the spotlight, becoming a symbol in a national conversation about race, this was entirely new territory. General Hawkins, sensing Cadell's discomfort, pulled him aside. "Listen, son," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, but sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't on the battlefield. They're right here at home, in the hearts and minds of our fellow citizens." Cadell nodded, drawing strength from the general's words. He thought about his family back home in Chicago. His mother, who had worked 2 jobs to support him. His father, who had taught him to always stand tall in the face of adversity. He thought about his younger sister, just starting college, and how he wanted to make the world a little bit better for her. As the day wore on, the story continued to evolve. Social media was ablaze with discussions about the incident, with hashtags like #RespectOurTroops and Flying While Black trending nationally. Civil rights organizations released statements condemning the discrimination Cadell had faced, while military support groups organized online campaigns to send messages of encouragement to the young soldier. In Atlanta, the airline was dealing with the fallout from the incident. They released a statement apologizing to Cadell and announcing a comprehensive review of their customer service policies. Oriana Johnson, the check-in agent who had handled the situation with such grace, was being hailed as a hero by many online, with people praising her professionalism and kindness. As evening fell in Washington, D.C., Cadell finally had a moment to himself in the quiet of his hotel room. He sat on the edge of the bed, his phone in his hand, scrolling through the seemingly endless news articles and social media posts about what had happened. It was surreal seeing his name and face plastered across the internet, reading strangers' interpretations of an experience that still felt intensely personal to him. He thought about Karen, the woman who had questioned his right to be in first class. Cadell wasn't angry at her, not anymore. Instead, he felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness at the prejudice that still existed in the world, hope that perhaps this incident would lead her to examine her own biases, and a weary determination to keep pushing for change, one small interaction at a time. As he was lost in thought, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from his mother back in Chicago. "Baby, I just saw the news. Are you okay? Your father and I are so proud of you. You handled it just like we taught you, with dignity and strength. Call me when you can. Love you." Cadell felt a lump form in his throat as he read his mother's words. He thought about all the times she had sat him down when he was younger, explaining that as a young black man in America, he would face challenges and prejudices that others might not understand. She had taught him to be proud of who he was, to never let anyone make him feel less than, and to always strive to be the bigger person. With a deep breath, Cadell dialed his mother's number. As Cadell spoke with his mother, reassuring her that he was okay and sharing the details of what had transpired, the story continued to unfold across the nation. In newsrooms from New York to Los Angeles, producers were scrambling to put together segments on the incident, reaching out to experts on racial discrimination, military affairs, and social psychology to provide context and analysis. In Atlanta, Karen Whitfield had finally made it home to her luxurious Buckhead apartment. As she walked through the door, she was immediately confronted by the concerned face of her teenage daughter, Emma. "Mom," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it true? Are you the woman from the airport everyone's talking about online? Karen felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. She had always tried to teach her daughter about the importance of kindness and respect, and now here she was, a viral symbol of prejudice and entitlement. With a heavy sigh, Karen sat down on the couch and patted the spot next to her. "Yes, honey," she said softly. "It's true, and I think it's time we had a very important conversation." As Karen began to explain to her daughter what had happened and why it was wrong, across town, Oriana Johnson was also dealing with the aftermath of the day's events. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from friends and family who had seen her on the news. As she sat in her modest apartment, Oriana couldn't help but reflect on the role she had played in the incident. She had always prided herself on treating every customer with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. But today's events had shown her that sometimes doing the right thing meant going beyond just being polite. It meant actively standing up against discrimination, even when it was uncomfortable or risky. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., General Hawkins was in a late-night meeting with several high-ranking military officials. The incident with Cadell had sparked a larger discussion about the experiences of minority service members, both during their time in the military and when they returned to civilian life. "Gentlemen," General Hawkins said, his voice grave, "what happened to Staff Sergeant Thompson today is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one that we have a responsibility to address." The other officials nodded in agreement, and soon the room was filled with the sound of earnest discussion. They talked about strengthening diversity and inclusion training, about creating more support systems for minority service members, and about how to use Cadell's story as a teaching tool for both military personnel and civilians. As the night wore on, the story continued to spread and evolve. On college campuses across the country, students organized impromptu discussions about racial prejudice and the treatment of veterans. In corporate boardrooms, executives hurriedly convened meetings to review their own diversity and inclusion policies, fearful of finding themselves in a similar public relations nightmare. In Chicago, Cadell's family gathered in his parents' living room, watching the late-night news coverage of the incident. His father, a Vietnam veteran himself, sat silently, his jaw clenched as he listened to the details of what his son had experienced. Cadell's younger sister, Isha, was furiously typing on her phone, sharing the story with her friends and joining online discussions about racial discrimination. As dawn broke the next day, Cadell awoke to find that his story had not faded from the public consciousness. If anything, it had grown even larger. His phone was flooded with messages from old Army buddies expressing their support, from civil rights organizations asking him to speak at events, and even from a few Hollywood producers interested in turning his experience into a movie. Feeling overwhelmed, Cadell decided to take a walk to clear his head. As he strolled through the streets of Washington, D.C., he found himself approaching the Lincoln Memorial. He climbed the steps slowly, his mind racing with thoughts of history, of progress made and progress still to come. Standing in the shadow of Lincoln's statue, Cadell thought about the Gettysburg Address, about a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He thought about how far the country had come since those words were spoken, and how far it still had to go. As he stood there, lost in thought, he noticed an older white couple approaching. They hesitated for a moment, then the woman stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but aren't you the soldier from the news? The one from the airport?" Cadell nodded, bracing himself for what might come next. But to his surprise, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "We just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for your service, and thank you for showing such grace in the face of ignorance. You've reminded us all of what real strength looks like." Her husband nodded in agreement, reaching out to shake Cadell's hand. As they walked away, Cadell felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps some good could come from this after all. Perhaps his experience could be a catalyst for change. A small step towards the kind of world he had fought to protect. Back in Atlanta, Karen Whitfield was facing the consequences of her actions. She arrived at her real estate office to find a somber-faced manager waiting for her. "Karen," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. We need to talk about what happened yesterday." Over the next hour, Karen listened as her manager explained that the company had been inundated with calls and emails from angry clients and community members. They were concerned about the image of the company and the values it represented. In the end, Karen was presented with a choice: take a leave of absence and undergo intensive diversity and sensitivity training, or resign. As Karen left the office, her career in shambles and her reputation in tatters, she found herself at a crossroads. She could retreat into bitterness and resentment, or she could use this as an opportunity for genuine reflection and growth. As she walked to her car, Karen made a decision. She would face this head-on, own up to her mistakes, and do whatever it took to become a better person. Meanwhile, Oriana Johnson's actions at the airport had not gone unnoticed by her superiors. She was called into a meeting with the airline's regional manager, unsure of what to expect. To her surprise, she was greeted with praise for her handling of the situation. The manager explained that the company wanted to use her actions as an example in their customer service training programs. Moreover, they were offering her a promotion to a leadership role in their diversity and inclusion initiative. As the day wore on, Cadell found himself in a whirlwind of meetings and interviews. He spoke with military officials about his experience, sat down with journalists to share his story, and even had a brief phone call with a senator who wanted to discuss potential legislation to combat discrimination against service members. Throughout it all, Cadell remained true to himself. He spoke honestly about his experiences, both the good and the bad. He talked about the pride he felt in serving his country, but also about the pain of facing prejudice in the nation he had sworn to protect. He emphasized the importance of education and understanding, of seeing beyond stereotypes to recognize the humanity in every individual. As evening approached, Cadell received an unexpected invitation. A local veterans group was hosting a dinner in his honor, and they wanted him to speak. Initially hesitant, Cadell thought back to his moment at the Lincoln Memorial, to the couple who had thanked him. He realized that he had been given a platform, a chance to make a difference. With a deep breath, he accepted the invitation. The dinner was held in a modest community center, filled with veterans of all ages, races, and backgrounds. As Cadell took the podium, he looked out at the sea of faces, some bearing visible scars of war, others carrying invisible wounds. He saw in their eyes a shared understanding, a common experience that transcended race or rank. "Good evening," Cadell began, his voice steady and clear. "I stand before you not just as a soldier, but as an American who has seen both the best and the worst of our nation." He went on to recount his experience at the airport, not shying away from the pain and humiliation he had felt. But he also spoke of the kindness of strangers, of the general who had stood up for him, of the airline employee who had treated him with respect. "What I experienced is not unique," he continued. "Many of us here have faced prejudice both in and out of uniform. But what I've learned, what I hope we all can learn, is that change is possible. It starts with each of us, with how we treat each other, how we challenge our own biases, how we stand up for what's right." As Cadell spoke, he could see heads nodding in agreement, could feel the energy in the room shifting. He was no longer just telling his story. He was giving voice to a shared experience, a collective hope for a better future. "We've fought for this country," Cadell said, his voice growing stronger. "We've bled for this country, and now we have to continue fighting, not with weapons, but with words, with actions, with the example we set every day. We have to fight for an America that truly lives up to its ideals, an America where everyone is judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." As Cadell finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Veterans stood, cheering and wiping away tears. In that moment, Cadell felt a profound sense of purpose. He realized that his experience, painful as it had been, had given him an opportunity to make a real difference. As the applause died down, an elderly veteran approached Cadell. The man's weathered face bore the marks of years of service, and his eyes shone with unshed tears. "Son," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I fought in Vietnam, came back to a country that didn't seem to want me, faced discrimination for being a vet, for being black. Hearing you speak tonight, it gives me hope. hope that maybe, just maybe, things are changing. Cadell clasped the older man's hand, feeling a connection that spanned generations of service and sacrifice. "Things are changing," he said softly, slowly, sometimes painfully, but they are changing. And we're going to keep pushing until they change all the way. As the evening wound down, Cadell found himself surrounded by fellow veterans, sharing stories and offering mutual support. He realized that in the midst of this challenging experience, he had found a new mission, a new way to serve his country. Back in Atlanta, Karen Whitfield sat in her living room watching a news segment about Cadell's speech at the Veterans Dinner. As she listened to his words about change and personal responsibility, she felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She reached for her phone and with trembling fingers began to type out an email to the local NAACP chapter. It was time, she decided, to take the first step on her own journey of change. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., General Hawkins was in a late-night meeting with several key members of Congress. They were discussing potential legislation to strengthen protections against discrimination for service members and veterans. The general spoke passionately about Cadell's experience and the broader issues it represented. "This isn't just about one incident or one soldier," he argued. "This is about who we are as a nation, about living up to the ideals we send our men and women to fight for." As the night wore on, the discussion in that wood-paneled room in the Capitol building grew heated but productive. Ideas were proposed, debated, refined. By the time the meeting adjourned in the early hours of the morning, the framework for a new bill was beginning to take shape. As a new day dawned, Cadell awoke to find that his story had not faded from the public consciousness. If anything, it had grown, evolving from a single incident into a national conversation about race, respect, and the treatment of veterans. He received a call from his commanding officer, informing him that he was being given extended leave to deal with the media attention and to participate in various speaking engagements if he chose to do so. The military, it seemed, had recognized the potential impact of Cadell's story and was willing to support him in sharing it. As Cadell prepared for another day of interviews and meetings, he thought about the long road ahead. He knew that changing hearts and minds was a slow process, that for every person moved by his story, there would be others who remained entrenched in their prejudices. But he also thought about the elderly veteran from the dinner, about the couple at the Lincoln Memorial, about his fellow soldiers who had reached out with messages of support. He thought about Oriana, the airline employee who had stood up for what was right, and even about Karen, who was hopefully beginning her own journey of growth and change. Cadell realized that his experience, painful as it had been, had created ripples of change that were spreading far beyond him. It had sparked conversations in living rooms and boardrooms, in military bases and college campuses. It had reminded people of the ongoing struggle for equality and the importance of standing up against discrimination in all its forms. As he stepped out into the bright Washington morning, Cadell felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought for his country on foreign soil, and now he would continue that fight here at home. Not with weapons, but with words, with his story, with the power of his example. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of pain and frustration. But Cadell was ready to face them. Armed with the strength he had gained from his military service and the support of those who believed in the power of change. As he walked down the street, his phone buzzed with another interview request. Cadell took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and pressed the accept button. He had a story to tell, a message to share, and a nation to help heal. One conversation at a time, one heart at a time, he would continue to serve his country, fighting for the ideals of equality and justice that he had sworn to protect. And so, as the sun climbed higher in the sky over Washington, D.C., Staff Sergeant Cadell Thompson stepped forward into his new role, not just as a soldier, but as a voice for change, a symbol of resilience and a beacon of hope for a nation still grappling with its long history of racial injustice. His journey, like the journey of the nation itself, was far from over. But with each step, with each word spoken and each hand shaken, he moved himself and his country a little closer to the ideals of equality and justice for all.